Well, welcome back to episode 105 of the Miles Driven podcast. Now, on this one, we are continuing on from our last episode where we're talking about starting a car company, what it takes, how many hurdles you're going to have to jump through, and just how big are the challenges have got to get something even past the point where you've actually got a car company, you've got a headquarters, you've got the tooling, you've got prototype, and we've ended our last episode by showing it to the world. Now, in this episode, we're going to talk about how you actually get a car from the point of inception, where you can say this is a final product, to the point where it is in showrooms ready to sell. Now, where we left off last time is we had a concept built for the outside. We didn't have an interior. So on this one, we're going to finish off the last part of making the car, and then we're going to talk about how do we even get this thing into people's hands? How do we get it past the point where it isn't just, something that someone takes pictures of for a website or for a magazine, but isn't actually something you can buy? So, first off, we've got to decide on an interior. And carrying on from where we were in the last episode, you'll remember I said that because we had relied on Volkswagen for the engine and for the hybrid system for our SUV, and we had relied on Mercedes for the engine for our sporty car, we were slightly limited as to what we were going to be able to do, because there's certain things that dictate how an interior of a car looks the same as the exterior, and how, where you put an engine and all that sort of stuff. We've managed to get over the external hurdles, but on the inside, we would like to build something that is, let's just say, a bit different from all the sort of touch screens and no button interiors that have been going on from around 2020 to 2025, and a lot of manufacturers are now starting to shy away from that end of the market. And we have looked at the option of putting buttons in and dials and all this sort of stuff, and we've been told how hugely expensive it is compared to just having one big touch screen, which is why many new entrants into the car market don't bother. They just put a touch screen there. And we've looked at how this would work, and ultimately we find, just like we could bring up so many examples of new car companies that are doing this, but ultimately, if it's a car built for a budget, people can be more forgiving just having a screen. If it's a car that's built for an enthusiast market or for people that really value the tactile aspects of an interior, touchscreens will never win them over. And actually, the greatest example of all of this would probably be Tesla. Because if, let's just say in the year 2016, you wanted an electric car that wasn't particularly limited in the way that a lot of cars in 2016 were, that were EV. Many of them couldn't do 200 miles of range, for example, or their charging speeds were quite slow, or they didn't have a charging network that supported them, or in many cases, the car itself wasn't really built to compete with the petrol and diesel cars that those manufacturers made. Now, zoom forwards, 2026, and it's a different world, but in 2016, if you'd said, well, I want to buy an EV, you would have pretty much only had Tesla. There were a couple of other manufacturers that were coming to the market, but they weren't really there with something that could directly compete with a Model S, for example, although price meant that unless you really wanted an EV, there was a lot of good cars to choose from. But if you did really want an EV, you would have had to get past the fact that you were just going to get a screen for the interior. You weren't going to get lots of different designs for the dials and switches that traditionally cars had had. Interestingly, at the time, back in 2016, this was all new. It was quite incredible to have everything through the touch screen. And so possibly the hurdle wasn't as high, but if you'd, demoed one and didn't like it, you were a bit stuck. The market has moved on from there, but what's interesting is that Tesla are kind of locked into that way of doing things. And as we've seen a ramp up of competitors into the market, either from new entrants or from legacy manufacturers, we've seen them all go down the same route, really. And then many have backed off and realised, actually, we want to keep the same customer that bought, 2 litre and 3 litre diesels from us. We want to keep the US market. But maybe those people have to have EVs. Well, what was it about our cars that they liked so much in the first place? And over and over, not just online. I have to say I should put a big dividing line between opinions people have in comment sections online, which I'd say around 10 or 15% are genuine, real concerns of buyers who are looking to buy a car. And then 85%, which I'd say are opinion-based. They possibly are a customer, but they're not particularly looking at any specific car. I get a lot of comments, for example, if I do, basically I can pick any brand. Maybe there's a few exceptions. Toyota maybe is an exception where people don't really click on it unless they're looking to buy one. But a lot of other brands, people just click on for, entertainment, or that they're particularly interested in the brand. Just like any of us, we might like sports, but just because we support one team doesn't mean we're not interested in what all the other teams are doing. And that seems to have been, that is a case on content. But one of the interesting things is a lot of the time you don't see that reflected in the market. So for example, if a manufacturer has been making a V8 car and then they stop making a V8 car and they make it a V6, you'll see a very, very strong opinion online. And then you'll see the showrooms, maybe there'll be a slight dip in sales. The BMW design language change was a great example. Everyone hated the sort of big front grille they put on the new 4 Series model cars, and then the 7 Series. And ultimately, buyers still turned out. People were very critical of the M4 when it was first released with its different front end, and that the M3 had to keep that same front end as the M4. And then, maybe they didn't sell as many as they had before, but the price went up. They still made a lot of money from it. And so that's where you have this difference of online opinion and real world opinion. And it's where it's quite challenging, actually, if you work in the media sphere of this world, because you can get an incredibly strong reaction. And then, you think, well, maybe that'll lead the market. Maybe I'm wrong in saying the rest of the car's good. If you can just get past this, the fact it's gone from V8 to V6, for example. And then, a couple of years pass, the hype goes away and people just carry on about their business and buy the cars, because actually once they've driven them, they realise they're okay. The interesting thing with touchscreens is initially, yes, it was different. It was cool. You could do stuff all through this screen. Then the novelty wore off, and then some bad applications came in, some poor ways of doing it, not very good user interfaces came in from some manufacturers. And you realise that there was, and there still is today, a very enthusiastic market of not having switches and buttons and just having a touchscreen. There is definitely a market that exists for those people, but it isn't the whole market, and it isn't even half the market. And so as we're looking at this landscape, designing our new car, we're having to make this very tough decision of, do we spend a lot of money? We've already spent tons of money, as you'd have heard in the first podcast, to try and get ourselves just to be a car company. And now we're facing the even bigger challenge that, yes, we're an established car company. Okay, we've shown the world a product, but we're trying to sell it at a competitive price in a market that is fascinatingly divided between a bunch of car manufacturers saying prices have to go up, and a lot of new entrants saying, oh, well, just tell us what you're selling it for and we'll sell it cheaper. And that has really made the car market, I think, when you talk of the price of new cars, it's more fascinating than it's ever been. When I worked in car sales, I said many times that, yes, there was a little bit of a difference between pricing. Yes, there was always a slight increase. Maybe it was a couple of hundred increase from a facelift to a pre-facelift, but you didn't see some of the wild increases in prices that we've had since 2020. And ultimately, car manufacturers making that decision, whatever reason they want to put the banner on, a lot of them will blame many other things, but ultimately, a lot of car companies are owned by by shareholders that want to increase profits. How do you increase profits? Well, you either increase sales or you increase the price. And when you've maxed out the number of people you can sell to, then you have to increase the price. And on the other side of that, you're competing against new entrants that just want to get some of the market. And so we've had this really interesting one side really heavy on price concentration, the other side desperately trying to hold on to what they've got and increase profits, and ultimately someone is going to lose. I don't think that has fully played out yet, so we'll find out more in the future. But for us, as we're trying to make our car company, we've decided our SUV is more of the mainstream market. And so we're going to put a few buttons in there, but only the ones that we think really irritate people to not have. So the climate control temperature to go up and down is going to be on a little switch up and down. And then the fan speed is going to be up and down. And then there's going to be a volume twisty knob thing. That's it though. All the rest of it we're going to do through the screen. Some people are going to be unhappy about that. We can do, I think Volkswagen probably are one of the standouts for me of how they approached the touchscreen in, say, 2021 and the updates they made in 2024. It's almost unrecognisable. If you get in a non-updated 2021 car and use the screen, it's pretty frustrating. You can get used to it, but it's challenging because it's not very well laid out, and you have to go through things to activate things that should just be there. And it shouldn't have taken really much time to put a few people in the car seat and say, well, what are you finding difficult to use, and then put that into production. But that's not what they did. And so the earlier, that's 2020 up to about 2024, a lot of Volkswagen cars, when you got in them, you would almost prefer to be in the earlier generation than in those touchscreen cars. In fact, I was advising someone to buy a Volkswagen about 4 years ago, and the facelift was just about to come in with all of these, they're going to remove all the buttons inside. And I said, if you buy today, you can get it with all the buttons. And they were like, well, let's buy it. Let's buy it now. Let's order it before they change this. And I think that was the right decision at the time, because the user interface was not very good. Now, zoom forward to 2024, you look at the current Golf, for example, they figured it out. I wouldn't say it's better than just having a dial to turn stuff on, but a lot of the things that you want to fall easily to hand, aside from, and I don't know why they do this, but the fan speed really frustrates me, that it's the climate button and then it's in. Fan speed's the one thing that, especially if it's a frosty morning and you want the fans whacked up to get the everything defrosted, and then you're into your drive, the last thing you want to do when you're driving is then hover your hand around, manage to touch the touch screen that says climate, then hit the thing, then hit it again. And every time you've got to make sure that as you're going over the bumpy roads that we all live around, that you're actually hitting the right button. So that's the only one. But apart from that, you get in the heated seat, for example, is just there. The climate control for up and down is just there. The ADAS control is just there. And a few other, CarPlay is just there on a button as well. It's all on the screen in front of you. So they made a big improvement. Now we've decided, because we're using, in our case, a lot of Volkswagen kit anyway, it's going to be a hell of a lot cheaper, as much as it pains us to do it, to go back to Volkswagen again and say, look, I know our car's looking a lot like a Volkswagen, but please, 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 can we have your screen? Because it's going to be so much cheaper if we can use your user interface. And Volkswagen are not very keen on this. Okay. And this happens a lot of the time in the car world when you have one company buying from another company, and they're buying, for example, an engine and a gearbox, or they're buying the chassis underneath the car. Today, particularly, a lot of the modules have to talk to the user interface or to the screen, because that then talks to the dials, even though it's all on a screen, the dials that are actually in front of you for your speed and stuff like that. And if you want to not use the things that the manufacturer that has done the engine and everything else is using, you need a completely custom setup. And cost-wise, there's probably a few manufacturers that could do it. They would probably be selling right at the top end of the market, or they would be selling a track car. I'm trying to think, maybe the Rospo. So years ago, people know the KTM Crossbow, which is a track car essentially, but for the road, used the 2-litre turbo Volkswagen engine, and that had its own display because it just had a digital display of speed, revs, fuel, essentially. So there, because they weren't using a lot of the other stuff, they could have their own sort of design there. But it was very limited information, and essentially you go without a lot of the modules to work everything else. And in a track car, that's fine because your buyer actually wants the least number of things to make the car work because it's all about speed and handling and lightness. We're selling an SUV. So we've gone to Volkswagen and we said, look, it's going to be a lot cheaper if we buy your stuff. And we kind of have to buy some of it anyway. And they begrudgingly said to us, this SUV you're building now is going to be a direct competitor for our Tiguan or our Touareg, depending on how big you make the thing. And that concerns us. And we sort of accepted that. And we're having to make, if you remember in the previous episode, I said Mercedes would let us have their engine, but they said we had to sell the car below a certain price point. Otherwise, we would be directly competing with them for their AMG GT because we were trying to build a sports car with a V6 engine. And although they fit the V8 and the 2-litre turbo to their sports car, we'd be essentially providing the market the car that they haven't yet. And in doing so, so they have the 55 model, don't they? But we would be directly competing within a market that they have sort of decided that there isn't too many buyers for. But if they were wrong, we would actually start stealing sales away from them. And they didn't want that, which is fair enough. So we've already constrained as to what we can do with our sporty car, which is now looking more like a fast saloon coupe type car than it is what we originally started out with an idea. And our SUV, it's starting to get very Volkswagen-y. But we've done the deal, we've got the screen, we've accepted it's not going to please everyone, okay? Which means we're giving up part of the market. And this is, again, current manufacturers today, they're having to make this decision, especially new entrant manufacturers who want to hit a certain price point, but know that once you start throwing in things that are very expensive to do, that are not forced to put in, like I mentioned in the last episode, you've got radars and things like that, you have to fit in because of the new safety laws, especially for Europe. You're trying to save money wherever you can, because ultimately, people are looking, think, like they always have done, you want the highest quality for the lowest price. But that price sensitivity has, I would say, increased over the last 5 years because people who had a bit more money years ago could just spend a bit more to get the higher specification of a regular car. So if I go back to when I sold cars, we would have about 4 or 5 specifications of a car, and there was quite a difference in price from the very top to the very bottom. I would say you could probably increase the price of the car by around a third, if not a little bit more than a third, by going for the very top specification with all the extras against the absolute base specification. However, you would generally accept there were 2 different customers. Basic example, just using Ford. Ford would sell a Ford Focus ST and an RS. Well, that car was a lot more expensive than the base, 1.6 petrol, but ultimately the customers are not the same. The shell of the car and the way it looks is the same, but those 2 people are unlikely to cross each other and in the street and say, oh yeah, I was thinking about your one, but I ended up with this. Not really going to happen. And manufacturers today find themselves more limited because those base cars essentially don't make sense for them, because you're having to sell the car that was previously the middle spec to pass all the regulation and the laws. And this is where we're stuck with our car company. And so what we've decided to do is sell 2 specifications, which is very limited, but it's actually more common than you think now. And if you shop around today, you'll find that most manufacturers are limiting specification to 2 or 3, maybe 4. If it's something that they that is very common, they might go with 4. If I use again the Volkswagen Golf, I think they have the SE, the Match, the R-Line, the Black Edition, and I'm tempted to say there is one more. There is a 5th in there, but that's it. And you go back far enough. Golfs had S, SE, then they had some sort of sports model, then there was some version of an R-Line. They used to have GT, then there was GT Sport, and then you would have some sort of more luxury-based specification. So you'd have sort of 7 or 8 versions. Now, of course, then you have the GTI, and then the R above that. And a Golf R buyer is almost certainly not a Golf Match buyer. So there's an example of where there is still this step-up process, but the Golf R is more than double if you look at list to list. In fact, it is probably pretty much exactly double the base model car price, and that's quite new. So price sensitivity is a big factor. We're going to do 2 specifications of our SUV. It's not exactly what we want. We're having to make a lot of compromises here, a lot more than we started out with. But we've put our attention to our sports car, and we said, well, this is getting some dials and twisty bits and things that feel different. So you've got in our brand of car. We are not stepping in a Mercedes or a BMW or a Volkswagen or a Toyota or even a Tesla. This is definitely our sports car. And our engineers have had a look at this. They've given us the price. We've fallen off our chairs again as we desperately try and keep the price of our sports car down. Remember, when I started all of this, I said, sporty, we're going to try and go MX-5, Golf R, Golf GTI. We're going to try and supply the market with something that is in some way affordable. Well, that's not going to happen, unfortunately. I think there's a real challenge in talking about all this and knowing what people will say in comments. And when I talk to people in the real world who are looking at buying cars and speaking to people at car shows or people within the industry that I know, and they're almost living on 2 different planets. It's incredibly difficult to understand now how we bring the car world back to one unified movement going forwards, because ultimately the car world was disrupted in about 2010. I'm not going to say it's all Tesla, because there were a few other entrants. You had Kia and Hyundai coming in the mid-2000s with cars that people actually were starting to say are getting close to the quality that they would accept. Because initially, Hyundais and Kias, if you drove them in the year 2000, they were cheap. You wouldn't necessarily directly compare them to a Japanese car, for example, to a Nissan or to a Honda. Now they're very close. And although they do feel different because there's a different ethos between manufacturers, the quality feel, the way they get down the road and how long they last is more comparable. And that started a disruption, then shifted the world from concentrating on engines to then hybrid systems, Toyota being a disruptor early in this, and then ultimately full electric vehicles. But all along that way, it's fractured a group of people who are car enthusiasts or just have general interest in cars to now having tribes and to having really strong differing viewpoints that I think make it very difficult. And, there's all other aspects to that. Social media, for example, if I do a video on a BMW, that will be shown to people who like BMWs. And the next time, if I did a video on a Lexus, it might not be shown to those people. And we've kind of lost what we had, 20 years ago, where you could be a fan, but you had a wider knowledge of the whole industry. I'm not saying people don't have that at all now, but definitely it has changed, and the amount of it that I at least see when I talk to people of a sort of wider view of the industry and what's really out there has definitely changed. And so, because of all of that, we're trying to find an interior for our car. We've managed to find it. We've managed to build something, and now we're at a point where we're saying, okay, good. We have 2 cars complete, ready to go. Fantastic. Now, I've put my notes up here because I think for some people, they'll think, great, well, rent a glass box, put them in there and people will buy them. It is, it's not going to be that simple. So there's a few things that we're going to need to do. First off, on my drop-down list that I have on the screen here, the car's got to be road legal. Okay, before we discuss anything further, cars have to become road legal. So they have to be homologated, they have to get type approval, they have to be emissions compliant for sale, and then there'll be crash requirements separate to crash safety testing. So that's Euro NCAP scores, IIHS, NHTSA in the US, ANCAP, Aussie New Zealander crash testing. Before all of that, we just need to make sure that it meets the minimum requirements. This also goes for the lighting regulations for the headlights and the tail lights. It has to now pass, I think it definitely has to pass it in Europe. I'm not sure in the US what their security laws are, but cyber security laws of modules being hacked, cars being able to drive themselves or being shut down. So there's some proof we're going to have to provide that. And after we've got past all of that, we're probably going to have to use external agencies to get us over the line, because each country or economic zone that we go to will have slightly different ways of filling out the forms, putting the requests in, showing the proof, and they'll all want ever so slightly different hoops to be jumped through. Ultimately, if a car works in for the European market, it will probably be able to be sold in other markets. But I did give you that example previously of, for example, the Alpina A110. That was in the previous podcast, and I said how that car couldn't be sold in the US because it couldn't pass the unbelted safety testing that is mandated there. And there's a whole story, and that was on the previous podcast. So if you listen to that, you'll know what I mean. Now, let's just say we've got past that point. We're going to now need to open some sort of flagship store.
If you're enjoying the show, then why not share it with a friend? And don't forget to add a follow if you're listening on a podcast player, or to subscribe to the Miles Driven podcast if you're watching this. And now, back to the show.
And we're going to have to make the decision of whether we want to sell direct, or we're going to have a dealer network. And if we're going to sell direct, it's not as simple as you may think. So what will happen in most markets, let's just say you're building it in country A and you want to take it to country B. You can either take care of all the importing, exporting, all the forms, everything yourself, or you can have, and there are a few big ones across the world, but basically importers or exporters for the markets that will say, okay, we do all the importing of cars for Europe. We do all the importing of cars for North America. We do all the importing of cars for China, for example. And they'll usually be a company that you can sign a contract with, and they'll say, yep, okay, this is what we'll do, and we'll be partnering with you. Obviously, you're going to have to be paying them quite a fair chunk of money, but that gets rid of a lot of headaches. Now, if you're going to do it all on your own, then you're going to need a department within where you work that are able to understand all the different rules and regulations and the laws as you take a car. Let's just, I've got a map in front of me. That's in the studio, my sort of desk mat is a map. So let's just say you were trying to build a car in Canada and you wanted to send it to Peru. Okay. Well, Canadians build the car, and then they need, for starters, they need to know what port they're going to send it to in Peru and how they should get it there. For example, if it's been built in Quebec, well, it's not a very good idea to take it to Toronto to then sail it down the St. Lawrence and then into the Atlantic Ocean and then through the Panama Canal and then round. It's a better idea for them to transport it within their own country, usually by rail, all the way over to Vancouver, for example, have a contract with a port in Vancouver to be able to manage their containers, put it on a ship, and then just sail down the North Pacific and then into the South Pacific and then arrive at Peru. But you're a car company. This side of logistics is going to be a huge, huge weight around your neck when you've got so many other things to do. And so we've partnered up with an import-export company, and we've said, look, we're really keen to sell this car across the world, but if we can't make it work and as I said this in the previous podcast, we can't make it work in Europe, China, or the USA, we're sunk. We can't make enough money from the rest of the market. And interestingly, I did have a quick look afterwards, because I said in that podcast, it's pretty much impossible if you can't sell in those three markets. I did just think, is there any examples that could break that rule? And ultimately, there wasn't, but the best examples I could find were if you were a domestic manufacturer in Japan, you can make, for example, the K cars, which are not usually exported outside of Japan, which just fit a domestic market. So you can build cars and just sell them in your homeland. And really, you have to be part of a larger organisation that are selling cars internationally. But a few of your cars, for example, then wouldn't. I did look quite keenly. I looked at Africa because it's such a large part of the world, and it's such a huge, diverse market to be selling into. And obviously, I'm going to exclude South Africa from this conversation because South Africa is already established. Usually, we'll get either European specification or American specification vehicles. Usually, you'll find that the cars that are sent there are very similar spec to Australia, because ultimately, the way that area of the world is working, the companies that are sending cars there know that these two countries don't have particularly differing laws. There are a few, but they're both right-hand drive markets. And if you're sending stuff to Australia, then it can actually stop in South Africa if it's coming from Europe or from America. Obviously, it's a different story with China, but for simplification, they'll do a similar thing. So just removing South Africa a moment. And again, the only manufacturer that I could see that had really got anywhere with this was Japan. The only manufacturer was Toyota. And maybe you could say Nissan too, but Nissan are now part of a larger group. So ultimately, it was just Toyota. And Chinese manufacturers are now keenly looking into the African market. I am separating generally, just in case you're not aware, there's a thing called the MENA region, so Middle East, North Africa. That's usually what is segmented off when you talk about a lot of different businesses. And in the MENA region, you would be taking nations that are quite close to Europe, which makes it much easier for exporting cars. For example, if you're taking a car to Egypt, it's not that much further than taking it to Cyprus or sending it to some of the other Middle Eastern nations, or Greece and Italy. It's just not that far, although you just can't do it via road. Now, China are obviously keen to export their cars. They also are supplying a market that they know is more price sensitive than Europe, and they have a domestic market that also is more price sensitive. Now, if I look over at South America, it's actually a really interesting story in South America, and I mentioned this last time. There is a high price sensitivity, but there is also a lot of demand for well-established brands selling some higher specification vehicles, particularly in countries like Brazil, where there is a portion of the population that would like to buy, I would say nicer SUVs. As I understand it, sports cars are not that popular across South America, even though they're very keen drivers, but they would be looking maybe at sportier hatchbacks, things like that. The car still has to do a lot of car stuff. And there's a lot of other sort of geographical issues that I don't want to go too far into, but I had a very, very good friend of mine who was from South America, who I worked with in the car trade for years, and he'd sort of explained this to me, unfortunately being more a case that most people don't want to have too flashy a car. It can just bring the wrong sort of attention. But that doesn't mean, no one has a Ferrari, for example. It's just, it's less popular there. And it would be more a case that people want capable vehicles. And so there is a market there, but again, no one, as far as I could see, can just sell a car in South America. What they can do, and what's been very popular to do, is to take the manufacturing of a European car or an American car and base it in South America, because the South Americans are actually quite well established in building cars. But if you can basically sell them their own version of a European, American, and as we go into the future, although they won't build them in South America, Chinese cars, because even compared to the labour rates of South America, China is still cheaper, even with the shipping costs. So, and they've obviously been really sort of building up relations there. Now, I've said all of that just to understand the hurdle we're now coming into, because we're saying, okay, fine, we've found someone who's going to send our cars, and we've explain to them how important it is for us to get our cars into those 3 key markets. And we just don't have a business case if they can't. And they've managed to get through the regulations and the hoops in all of them. Now, I should explain, China would be extremely difficult, if not near impossible, to do without having a local agreement with one of the car companies or the larger groups that already exist. So if you think of Audi, good example, Audi very, very rarely, if ever, are building cars. In fact, is it fair to say if ever? It's probably just fair to say very rare that they would build a car in Europe and that car would just be exported all the way to China and then number plates put on it, and that's the only integration that Chinese Chinese companies would have with a car, and Chinese authorities actually, because they're the ones that have to designate that it is road legal and can have a number plate put on it. What would be more likely is partnership would be made with a Chinese vehicle manufacturer. They would give them the designs and then they would just build the car as if it was in its home country being built, and they would just sell to their domestic market. And we're not keen on doing that. But as our exporter has told us, he said, well, if you don't do that, you pretty much can't sell there. And so with a heavy heart, we're saying we're going to look away from the Chinese market. We're going to stick with Europe and North America, which if you read, a lot of car news and industry news, you'll know that is current sort of concern for a lot of European manufacturers today. They're not sure on how long they will have the presence that they've historically had in China, and whether they should be sort of refocusing to the markets that have long been established for them. And it's a difficult decision, and I don't envy the people having to make that decision, because China is a country of 1 billion people. It's got a fast growing economy that may be slowing down slightly, but is still growing faster than most of the rest of the world. And there is, at least currently, a positive view of a lot of Western brands who, make cars, for example. But there's also a growing domestic enthusiastic market for domestic cars, and their domestic car brands have raised the bar as to what they can produce, which, there's only, even in a market that size, there is only so many customers that are willing to spend a large portion of their income on a vehicle. So there's this refocus going on. Everyone wants to sell a car in the US. I should state that. I don't really know anyone that would say they're not interested in the US as a brand. Certainly there are some cars that you just wouldn't send to the USA. So for example, it's a good... a small pickup truck from one of the Japanese manufacturers. It just, as much as actually, funny enough, some American commenters that I get and people I've spoke to in the US, along with a couple of people I've known historically who've got jobs in industry over there, have always sort of made this quote of, we think something, a smaller pickup truck would sell well. The smallest one is probably something like in Europe, we have the Ford Ranger, same for the Aussies and for the South Africans, and it's very popular there, or the Volkswagen Amarok, sorry. But sending them to the US, you're going into a market well established for trucks the size of the Ford F-150, and so the Japanese manufacturers, for example, long accepted that it's better just to build a larger pickup truck in the US and not try and export their smaller ones, particularly because of price. So anyway, with all that out the way, we have decided we're going to launch our cars going Europe, USA. We've promised the Aussies and New Zealanders will be coming for them soon, along with the South African market. And then after that, we're looking at the MENA region, so the Middle East, North African countries. We're not sure that they're going to be that interested in us, but we're hoping that some aspect of our sort of Franken, Mercedes and Volkswagen design or internal cars will capture their imagination. And then we're going to have another look. We've already looked at a very interesting market of the world, which is India, growing market, especially for cars. But we also know that, that could have its own challenges from the point of trying to compete with other manufacturers. So we've got to the point now. Let's jump ahead. We've got to the point where cars are landed in countries. And in that meantime, while they've been on the ships, we've been desperately trying to get ourselves some sort of dealer network set up, because selling direct, Tesla-made selling direct, I'm not going to say look easy, but look like it's something that anyone could do. It's failed pretty spectacularly for some of the major manufacturers that have tried to do it. They've spent a lot of money. Still have quite a few friends that sell cars, and I will remember when during the lockdowns of, say, 2022, 2023, and I was working for one of the main automotive magazines, and we would report every now and again that, another manufacturer now lets you order online to just be, have your car delivered to your house. You don't have to go to the dealership. You don't have to look at it in the dealership. You just go online. You can look at all the specification online. You don't need to speak to anyone. And from the comfort of your own home, you'll have the car that you want delivered to your door. Yeah, it's pretty bad failure, for very obvious reasons, actually. I mean, even Tesla made sure they had what they called sort of like display showrooms. Basically you could go and look at a car, but they weren't a dealership, and they sort of sidestepped a lot of rules and regulations around that. But they gave people the ability to go and physically visit somewhere to look at something and then be told, you can't buy it here, but here's the link to go online. And actually you could even to speak to people about how to customize the car, paint colours, options, things like that. And they could tell you everything. They just couldn't do the final hurdle. The reason I think that failed so badly in the main, for the legacy manufacturers that had dealerships, if you'd come into me when I sold cars and said, I've been online and I really like the look of this car, but I'd like to come and see it and test drive it, I'd be selling you that car. You wouldn't be leaving to buy it online. I'd have been sacked. That's the truth. It's a harsh truth. A lot of people have no time for the car sales industry and the people that work within it. Most of them, hard-working people with families, but desperately trying to make their income just like you are. And if you come in and say, you're looking to buy something online, you're a customer. You're buying it anyway. Why wouldn't you be buying it from me today, with a nice coffee, and we'll sit down and we'll do everything here? Why do you want to go home and, sit around? And ultimately, I can understand why some people, especially if you're a bit introverted and you want to take your time and not have someone else talk to you, you just want to be on your own and make this very important decision. But that is, if you were a car salesman, that would be the end of your industry if you were not able to get those people to then buy the car from you. And that's a load of jobs gone. And with that, the dealership goes, and then you got nowhere to service it. You got no support either. So I could completely understand why it failed, because most salesmen can make a very good argument for that. Tell people, look, if you have a problem, you can call me. Or if you don't know how you drive it 5 minutes off the forecourt and then something bleeps and you don't know what it is, you've got my phone number, you've got my card. Now, I know there are some terrible car salesmen out there who don't do all those things, and people who've experienced that will say to me, no, it's much better just to buy it online and figure it out yourself. I get it. I absolutely do. But I can understand why on a system that has dealerships with salespeople in it, not rooms of display cars with what they called like product geniuses in there that weren't salespeople, weren't trying to sell you anything, weren't commissioned to sell you anything. I can understand why that business model could at least function in a way that if you're sending people into a dealership, why would they even bother inquiring online? They're just wasting their time. They might as well just go in and do what they've been doing for the last 5 decades. Walk in, talk to someone, see the physical car in front of them, decide whether it's what they like, take it for a test drive, and if they like it all, strike up a deal with the person in front of them. I think that the problem for us with our new car company is we're going to have to, we just haven't got the money to be sort of throwing it left, right and centre, building our own dealerships, but we have started 2 flagship dealers because we're very clever and we want to start the market up. So we've started one in New York, one in London. That's gone okay. So we could put one in Los Angeles, one in Paris, one in Berlin, and so on and so forth. And we're going to keep ownership of those dealerships, which means we're on the hook for them surviving. Now, in case you're wondering, there are a lot of manufacturers that do this, especially specialist manufacturers. They'll have maybe 1 or 2, and they'll be owned by the head office, and there's no different experience for you going there. It's just the profits from those dealers go back straight to the manufacturer rather than being kept by the dealer network. On the flip side of that, if the dealership's making a loss, the manufacturer's taking it on the chin, and it's not just seeing a dealer sort of absorb that and try and survive without passing those losses on. This is where there is a little bit of balance in the system. And so we've partnered up with a couple of dealers who are already selling a couple of specialist vehicles, and they said, we've got some space in the corner of the showroom, we'll put your name on top of our glass building, and how about we do that? And we've agreed. And so cars are actually now, they're on the ships, they're landing in the country's ports soon. We've leapt through hurdles to get them so that when they arrive, they're just going to be ready for number plates, a basic PDI pre-delivery inspection, and then they can be sold to customers. The challenge is, now that we've managed to get this dealerships going, and I should say this part alone could be a 3-hour podcast, because you're essentially trying to strike up relationships with businessmen and women from all different parts of the world, and you're trying to understand if they really have the business acumen, B, the experience, and C, the financial ability to support you as you start selling cars. Because the car trade can be very profitable. You know, you look at how many specialist used car companies there are, and that's great evidence. You know, these people are just buying cars from an auction or buying for people from they know in the trade, putting a margin on and selling. And if you do that successfully, you can be a very successful business person in the car world. But the best way possible, because if you're selling used, you've really got to pull customers into you. If you're selling new, well, if people are interested, you know, basically the manufacturer does the marketing, the advertising, they're showing what you have to the world. All you have to do is be ready for when people are directed to you, because you're going to be the only one around for, depending on what your agreement is, maybe 50 miles, maybe 30 miles, maybe 100 miles, maybe you're the only one in your state, in which case people are coming to you. So it can be better off. And so most people, especially if they've been in the game for a long time, would like to have their own dealership selling new cars. It's not always a brilliant idea. A few really good examples, Fisker. I've seen a couple of dealerships in the UK who took on Fisker. They trained up all their staff to be able to service those vehicles, and obviously the company went bankrupt, and they've got a lot of stock that they're trying to shift. Bearing in mind the way it works with dealers, they're essentially buying it from the manufacturer. So if the way you think of it is you're buying from the manufacturer, you are not. Okay, you walk into a dealership, you are buying solely from that dealer. They are the seller of that product, and they have bought that from the manufacturer, or they have it on a short-term loan, which is very, very common. You'll have it on a between 30 and 90-day loan. And if you sell it in that time, you pay off your loan and you take your profit. And if you don't, you start being charged by the manufacturer for not selling one of their vehicles as sort of a punishment to get it gone, because they need to keep building cars, because they need to keep the factory open, they need to keep people in their jobs. And if you've heard of factory shutdowns or 4-day weeks, this is all because there's not enough demand. So they need to keep the pressure on the dealers to keep selling the cars, and that is felt all the way down the line to the customer, and then people get very unhappy about it and say people are pushy, which that's the economy. The car sales, I think, is one of the most easily understood for how economies work. You know, there's a job of someone who builds a car. There's a job of someone who transports a car. there's a job of someone who sells a car, and there's a customer at the other end of it who buys the car. And then the money goes all the way back to the person through the system, everyone taking their cut all the way along to the person that built the thing on the factory line. And if you lose the customer who's paying, all those jobs start to disappear. It's the classic example of we all work for each other. If you think, you're unique in a society or an economy, you are not. We all work for each other. Doesn't matter if you're retired or, once the age of 18, once you're an adult, or at school if you're working, because you're doing a job that relies on someone else demanding it. There are no jobs that I'm aware of, unless you were being completely self-sufficient on a farm, locked away from the world. That would probably be the only time that you would be completely isolated from the world economy. Aside from that, you are, and even then you probably have to buy fertilizer or something. So yeah, your job generally relies on someone else's job, which relies on someone buying something, which is why it's always critical that we give people enough ability to spend money. Otherwise, we're all out of a job. So anyway, that was a bit of an off to the side. We've managed to do all our partnerships. There are not many of them because we want to keep things small and keep a sort of a lid on things so that things don't run away from us. We have then started to invite car journalists, people from magazines, YouTubers, people who have their own established online following, and people who are TV presenters who may have some sort of car aspects to their show, whether it's a car show or whether someone drives around the country showing people nice things. Well, maybe we want to put our car in their hands so there's a few shots of them driving it around on their TV show. All of these things matter. The trouble is, what really, 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 really matters is that you have car journalists saying at least something positive. If it's pretty difficult if you get bad reviews to sell cars. That's the truth of the car media world. It's not a hard and fast rule, because there are some cars that got very bad reviews, but the public still liked them. But it does make it more challenging if you can't convince people that drive everything all day long, every day of the week, that this is at least a reasonable contender. And the ways in which that are done, we're not going to go into in this podcast because it's its own whole subject. But of course, you can just do what established car manufacturers done for a long time, which is you'll have a press fleet. You'll call up, contacts you've got. You'll find the press officers for different journalists. They're probably contacting you, to be fair. And then you say, yeah, we've got, a couple of cars when you want to book one in. Oh, you want to book it in, next Tuesday? We've got a car coming back on Monday. It works a little bit like a rental car office. You're just booking the diary and making sure cars are available, they're clean, they've got legal tyres and brakes and things like that on them. They're not having a problem. No one's crashed them, all that sort of stuff. And then send it out, let people do their review of it, get the car back, and it's on to the next one. Now, there is obviously exceptions to that. You can have a campaign where you're sponsoring an event. For example, BMW, Lexus, a few other brands, they like to sponsor golf tournaments. So you'll see a car there. It's usually either a dealer car or it'll be the manufacturer demo, and they'll have their badge plastered everywhere. Very common for football teams, for basically any sporting event. Anywhere where someone is going, can be a music concert, it could be a car sort of out the front. If you go to Costco and shop in Costco, you'll quite regularly see a couple of cars parked out the front, and they'll have some stickers all down the side of them, and it will be, a Toyota or a Nissan or a Ford, and it will say, local dealer doing a deal of XYZ. That could either be the local dealer taking that upon themselves, or it could be a manufacturer sort of saying, right, we're going to put a push in this market. We think we can sell cars here, or it's quite a hot market for us. Let's stick a few cars around the place and try and beef up the awareness of any deals we've got on. You can also obviously run adverts in all different types of media explaining deals that you've got on. All of this is to attract people to your brand, but the one that people say it's not as relevant now as it once was. I think it still is relevant. I just think the relevancy has changed. And people don't necessarily buy the car magazine every single week, read it cover to cover, and then discard it. I think people become aware of things through advertising, through social media posts, through obviously this is the podcast version of the Miles Driven, but the Miles Driven itself, we'll test drive cars, or we'll write news stories on cars, we'll cover news in the podcast of cars that we hear are coming out. All of this is just an awareness campaign. If you really need to build awareness from scratch, so a lot of the Chinese manufacturers are very good examples of this. Yes, you need the old school media and the new school media, but you're going to have to run a pretty thorough marketing campaign too, usually by spending money in the old school media. You may spend your money in the new school media too, running, for example, an Instagram ad, so that people scrolling through Instagram who are looking at cars suddenly see, look, this car company exists, just to get the mind around a new brand name, for example. We've done all of that at colossal cost. The thing I should really put down here and say, there's been huge costs all along the way. And I'm hoping that throughout these couple of podcasts we're doing here, there's a little bit of an understanding of why car manufacturing is such an attractive business, but is so difficult to make money in. And that may seem complete nonsense if you think about how much money car brands can make each year, but you're hearing the story of the selective few. And as I said in the previous podcast, well over 1,000 car companies have ever existed. Some names I could just, Saab is a great, most people have heard of Saab. They're no longer around. So there are well-established, well-understood, known names that are gone and gone forever. And that is just how difficult it can be. And really, you don't need too much of a drop-off for it all to be over. There's a few long-standing companies, Toyota, very good example, Mercedes-Benz, one of the best examples, the Volkswagen Group, Ford, that have been around for so long. They have support not just from the markets, the private markets, public markets. There are government investment in some of these companies because they support so many jobs. And when you have things like the 2008 financial crisis or the coronavirus lockdowns, they may get support to keep them in business, because otherwise the impact to the economy and the loss of jobs would be so severe. A bit like the octopus example I gave in the last podcast, you would start to see mass job losses in your market. And as much as most politicians don't always know what they're doing, they do know that mass job losses will probably not be good when they come to try and get re-elected. So this is where it comes to a point of, you can see how much money we're spending and we haven't sold a car yet. And this means that ultimately we're going to have to do one of two things when our cars now get into dealerships. We've got some journalists in them. They've said they're all right. We've taken that. We'll take all right. We're new. All right is fine. They're not saying it's bad. That will be enough to get at least a few people who are intrigued into our showrooms. Now, we've managed to get some pretty good salespeople in on this, and we've said, look, we'll pay huge bonuses if you can just sell a few cars. We just need to see these things on the road, because one thing that's been very interesting over the last 15 years is the amount of hype and talk and excitement, I would say, by car brands trying to come into the market, and then they disappear. They sell 10 cars. A Fisker, again, I'm going to use them as an example. They come in, got a car, here it is, it's in dealers, we've done all the things, boom, gone. Maybe a couple of years of existence, gone. And so it's quite a difficult position that we're in right now with our car company, because we've spent all the money. There isn't really much more we can do. We've done all the press stuff now, so we've got digital assets, we've got photography, we've got press cars ready. We've had interviews done with our engineers. We've managed to get as many people as possible to say that, our product is not bad. And ultimately, and another key thing I want to say about car reviews, only because I'm in this industry, having a trustworthy review, whether it's, only that the car's, say, a 2 out of 5 star, has more value today than it probably did 5 years ago. The industry around reviewing cars and the media around cars, you saw it 10 years ago. A lot of nice things were said about a lot of cars, and ultimately, not all cars can be great. It's why I've said it so many times when I've reviewed cars. You'll see it on the Miles Driven channel if you watch there. It's almost impossible for me to score 10 out of 10 on a car. It would have to be, I don't know, a V12 Ferrari being sold for £20,000. That's ticked every single box going, it's 10 out of 10. To achieve perfection in the car world usually comes at a colossal cost. And I'll always sort of say, I'm going to mark it down because it's just too much money. And too much money means I'm talking to such a small sliver of society that could actually afford this vehicle. I don't feel it would be fair to give 10 out of 10 because not enough people will ever drive it to be able to say fairly it's scored in every department as high as possible. There may be an exception, and there are certainly 9 out of 10 cars. There are some absolute corkers out there who maybe you start to have to forgive them a little bit for their price. You start to say, look, they're a little bit more money than I'd like it to be. But understanding everything that's got that car here, the fact that it's so good, means it's going to get, say 9.5 out of 10, but scoring 10 out of 10. And I think 10 years ago, 8 years ago, you used to hear every single car going was 10 out of 10. Every car was amazing, and every person who works in, let's just say, non-legacy media was sort of more willing, if they didn't have a long-established through line of trust, they were just willing to say some very, very kind things. And look, each to their own, but it's not what we do on the Miles Driven, that's for sure. And if you can get, as a car manufacturer, someone who is known to be trustworthy within their reviews, have a following of people that say, look, if they say it's really good, it probably is really good. And if they say it's rubbish, then maybe it's rubbish. But I'll always caveat, what I think is rubbish is probably pretty average. It's just that most people might drive 5 cars when they're looking to buy a car. If you work in the industry, you've driven pretty much everything. If I just think historically what I've driven, I don't think there's any car brand that I haven't driven. There's certainly a few cars within brands that I haven't driven because there's, £1 million hypercars and I haven't driven really any of those. Part of that is being so tall, I'd struggle to fit in them anyway, so it doesn't interest me. But I can appreciate the bodywork, but that's it. But on the flip side of that, I'd say the industry as it sits would prefer to get that sort of trustworthiness of people saying, well, I really like this person. They said they don't really like it, but I'm still going to have a go in it. Jeremy Clarkson really didn't like the FN2, if that means anything to you, FN2 generation Civic Type R. Didn't really give it a very good review. That's the sort of 2007 to 2012, 2013 Civic Type R. People still bought it. And I mean, I've driven that car. And I remember driving it. He had his review, I think, 2006. So I drove it about 2 years later. And I remember thinking, no, I love the previous generation Type R. I've had several of them. But I still thought the FN2 was actually, there were a lot of things to like about it that were not highlighted by him. But I understand he was making a comparison between 2 cars. He'd driven everything else. And that wasn't what he felt was at the top of the market. Fine. That's a trustworthy, at the end of the day, you could say, well, I trust that's his opinion. I'm still going to have a go of it because I think there were some things that any good reviewer would point out as being positives. And that's, I think, what he did in that review. Again, you could pick loads of cars like that. But another good top gear one was the BMW X5M. They had the V12 diesel, I think it was, or V10 diesel, Q7. And they had them on track, and they said, well, these cars are crazy, who would buy them? But in the meantime saying, well, they'll do 0 to 60 in 5 seconds and blah, 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 and you think, there's a lot of people that want that, Maybe you don't like it, but at least you've been honest enough to say, there are these attributes that you may like. We don't think it's what you should buy. But if you have trust, then that's really, really important. I've gone on a little bit about this only because I want to sort of highlight what I think has really, really become important to car manufacturers, which is that paying people or getting positive reviews, it doesn't really matter if that person is known to only ever give kind reviews. So sometimes it's important to get, the car's just average, or the car has things that are not good, because ultimately not everyone will think they're not good. So yeah. Anyway, we've got past all of that, and some people have said our cars are basically plumb average, and we're happy with that because at least it's got it out there in the world. So that was what we call our so my notes here, I've put real world validation on that one. We've created a strategy for how we're going to put our cars out there. So we've had our launch, we've had some people drive it, we've had the magazine reviews, we've had the YouTubers in, we've had the Instagram stars in, we've had a few TV shows that are interested in these cars. They've all had a go, and there's a lot of hype and talk. We followed it up with a big advertising campaign. We've been on the social platforms, and we are starting to send people into physical locations, shopping malls, football stadiums, stood next to our cars saying, would you like to have a look inside? Do you want to speak to the local dealer? Give us your phone number. I've actually stood by the cars doing that, and I've been the salesman that was there. And lovely, lovely people that you work with who are usually actresses and actors, or they are sort of media personalities, and they've been hired for a couple of days' work, and they're really just smiling at people and chatting, and they're very unthreatening. That people don't find them scary to talk to, because they say very clearly, look, I don't know everything about it, but here it is. What do you think to it? Look, I'm not trying to sell you it because that's not my job. And people are very honest with them. And occasionally you'll have a salesman there. So I've done that. And if someone was particularly interested and wanted more details, then they were put over to me, and I'd have a chat with them about more specific stuff. And then maybe they'd give me their phone number, and I'd give them a ring and book them in for a test drive. So that's all now done. And we have got to a point where our cars are in dealers, but we have to give a price now. From the second the media showed up, we had to have a price ready. And I said at the start of all this, I wanted to really try and get something that was sporty but affordable. And I'm going to say we failed. Okay, the sporty car that we have is £65,000 on the road, and the SUV is going to be £57,000 on the road. At this point, and that I actually think you'd be struggling if you're buying so much from other manufacturers, but maybe we've accepted we're going to work at a bit of a loss for a little while, and then we'll raise prices once we've got a following. The one advantage we have is we went to the finance companies before we decided on our price, and we said, look, we've got our insurance certification, we've got all of the things that we need for safety, we have a proper product here, and we think it's going to last a very long time and that it's going to be desirable. And the finance companies actually agreed with us, so we've got at least some reasonable residual values, and this is where a lot of new EV brands are struggling, because getting a strong residual value when EVs have been struggling to increase their sales. And there's a couple of things I just want to say, because I had a few comments. I always do little snippets from the previous podcasts, and I do it on the main channel as well, and I put them on the shorts reel. And you'll always get people saying basically an opinion which is very, very far from fact. So I just want to settle something here, which is, if you're sat there and you have read online someone telling you the whole future of the industry is only EV, they are giving an opinion. They are not basing that in any facts. And the reason I say that, like I said previously, £65 million lost by manufacturers trying to do EV-only strategies, and they've had to go back on it because the market hasn't grown at the level they are fundamentally forced to get to because of regulation And even with all of that and incentives, they can't do it. So saying that the future is only EV is basically ignoring the entire market, all the facts, all the manufacturers, all the analysts, all the banking people, and all the people that do this as a profession who spend day in and day out trying to understand the market. Some people believe their opinion is even better than all of these people. I'd suggest you don't listen to them. Doesn't mean that we won't have a future of EVs, but suggesting that they will be the next generation of cars and everyone will buy them, it's probably a bit far-fetched. The other interesting thing is when people talk about EVs, there's been a lot of admittance now throughout key markets that I told you about. So Europe, the USA, China is getting there, but it's not there yet. That if everyone tomorrow, just say somehow it was possible, parked up their petrol and diesel cars and their hybrid cars and started driving EV only, you would crash the grids in all of those countries. I saw a very strange comment from someone suggesting that for the last 10 years, the UK has had the capability to be 100% EV, which is so far detached from reality that I would question that person's sense. So the grids are expanding dramatically, but we have a lot of different industries putting increased pressure on the grid. You've probably heard of the artificial intelligence, warehouses sucking up a lot of power. You've probably heard about energy companies struggling as fossil fuels become scarce or because of different conflicts in the world, more difficult to get hold of, and renewables are being imposed and enforced and even subsidized to come into the market, but they still haven't ramped up as fast as needed to meet the future of energy demand plus the EV demand. And I think this is why there is a little bit of relaxation on saying, actually, let's we know there will be a future where people will be plugging their cars in, either partially or wholly, but if it's just off the grid, most countries, I'm struggling to actually think of a country that could do it tomorrow, because if you think average household in a country, so I'll just use my own, I think we have solar on the roof, so I'm probably not a very good example, but I think about 2,000 kilowatt hours of energy a year. That's probably about right. Might be wrong, but something roughly around that. And that's just the house. Average car battery size, about 70 kilowatt hours today. So I could charge my car up 29 times and I would be doubling my house take from the grid. I'd be doubling my energy usage. That would be charging 29 times. If you think average battery, let's say, does 250 miles, I would need 4 charges per month to do 1,000 miles, which is near enough average. If I could get a bit more miles than that, I'm going to be really kind to it all. I'm going to say I can get a bit more miles than that and do a little bit less miles, so I only need to charge 3 times. Well, that would be 36 times I'd have to charge. So you can see the problem here, which is I'd be more than doubling my consumption at a time when we're saying we are challenged in our future energy needs in most developed nations. But as I say, some people don't want to pay any attention to that. The only reason I bring it up is because this is why there is such support for EVs, but why a lot of EV manufacturers who are seriously wanting to sell their cars and sell their hybrid cars and have a future for the industry, this is why they're all saying we need support not just for the unit, the thing that you sell. We must have support for the infrastructure around it. It's just impossible. You know, if tomorrow you said we're going to ban all petrol and diesel sales and we're just going to stop the tankers coming in, people simply wouldn't go to work on Monday. If they had a petrol or diesel car, there's nothing to go into it. EV manufacturers that want to sell as many EVs as possible are saying, that's all well and good to sell them, that's great, but what we don't want is someone who's a customer of ours to ring us up and say, I hate my car because I can't get enough power into it. You know, I don't want someone to not be able to get to work on Monday solely because they made the decision to have an EV. And car manufacturers of all are the most concerned about that, because how many times would you buy a car that let you down? Yeah, and I'm not talking about breakdowns, but I'm saying, if your neighbour can get to work in their 35-year-old diesel BMW and you're stuck at home because the grid's gone down, yeah, well, you're going to go out and buy yourself a 35-year-old diesel car, and it's not the ideal scenario for anyone. You want people to buy cleanest possible cars possible, and as you've seen in our example, that may not be the options that people have on the table, because, as I've said, doing the maths on what you'd bring to market would be over £50,000 to supply what we've talked about here. And really? Now, one area that we could do well at if we were trying to get our car company to do better, and I hope that sort of just has expanded the point on EVs. Everyone should know I'm not anti-EV. I've run an EV, run hybrid cars, and I think they suit a lot of people. I just don't think they suit everyone. And also, I'm very aware, having worked in the industry for a little while, that it's not the easy maths that some people seem to claim that it is. I think there's a lot of carrying forward projections of the future, and then you hear that those projections are based on projects that are either delayed or actually are not happening at the same time we're shutting down older means of creating energy. So there is a bit of a crunch, and I think it's a real concern. And I do actually worry for some manufacturers who are sort of really hammering a very true point here, which is they can build the cars. They're okay with building the cars. That's fine. They as long as they can sell a car. Most manufacturers, do they care if it's petrol, diesel, electric or hybrid? Yeah, maybe a few, but ultimately they want to just stay in business, making products that they enjoy making. And if the infrastructure around that product isn't being supported, I can see why they would be concerned. So in our case, we haven't got to worry about that, because we've got a hybrid that can be driven even if the whole grid went down, and our sports car. So, our customers are not too worried. But we've gone to leasing companies and we've said, look, what we could really do with is a big order. That would be fantastic. Could we get a really big order of cars? And we're willing to offer a discount. But our prices are already at a bit of a loss, if we're honest. And leasing car companies have said, we don't really care. We have to offer the cheapest price possible. And if you don't give us that, we're not going to offer you cars. So we've gone back to our investors, who are sick to the back teeth of us because we've taken all their money, made products that they didn't particularly want us to make, massively overspent, and now we're selling cars cheaper than we have to make money. And we're asking them, can we sell them at an even further loss just to get them into the market? Now, because our investors love us for whatever mad reason, they've said yes. Knock 20% off the price and put it onto the leasing market. This may seem like a good answer. The trouble is, when you sell a lot of cars to a leasing company, you will have an impact on the residual values, because those leasing companies will buy up huge quantities of them. They will offer fantastic deals to businesses or to private individuals on, a set lease plan, let's say 2 years or 3 years. And then after that, they will just get rid of the cars, and they'll do it en masse because they don't have the space. They're not a car company. They're merely a financial organization trying to make money from that bit in the middle. And so they'll have an agreement with auction companies or with car resellers, used car establishments, to just take their cars en masse. But it's like anything. When you go to the supermarket and you look to buy some chocolate, if there's only one chocolate bar in the supermarket, they can pretty much ask whatever they want price-wise. If there's 500 of them, then you've got a lot of choice, and so you become a little bit more picky about price. If ultimately you go somewhere and there's a lot of supply into a market, but the demand doesn't quite meet it, you'll find that people have to become, or the businesses have to become, very sharp on pricing. So if we use our chocolate example, let's just say there's 20 chocolate brands in the country, and you go into a shop, and this shop has just had all of its deliveries from all of these chocolate brands in June, and is a little bit worried that they might melt. So they've put all of them on the stands in front of you. Well, they're going to be very keen for you to buy more than one chocolate bar. probably don't want more than one chocolate bar. And so they might put a deal on it and say, well, if you buy one, you get one half price. Or if you buy three, we'll give you one for free. Whatever the deal may be. And that is essentially devaluing the product, because it's saying that because there's so many of them, we're going to have to sell them at an even cheaper price because we want to get rid of them. And so we've answered a short-term problem here, which is that we've got our cars onto the markets, but we do have a concern that we did so with financial institutions backing us for residual values. But if we have, 10,000 going onto the market in 3 years, all painted blue, all basic specification, all nothing really special about them, they're going to have to be sold at quite a discount to shift them. And what's that going to do to our residual values? They're going to get lower. And that's going to make the gap between what our residual value is in 3 years and our brand new prices, especially in 3 years, because we're planning to put prices up, it's going to make that gap even larger. And that means the new car customer is going to have to fill a larger gap with financing. And that is the trap many car companies fall into. It's what has essentially killed off certain car brands selling types of cars, because they did very well for a year or two selling en masse. Then it became critical to get a good residual value, and they couldn't get one because there were so many of them being chucked onto the used market. Now, if you're really smart, really good with business, what you can do in the meantime is restrict the supply, facelift the car, change things, get some favourable reviews if you've done a good enough job, and increase the demand on the new end, so much so that people that can't afford the new one actually go rushing out to buy the used one because, they've heard that this is such a good car. And that is very common among luxury car manufacturers, BMWs, for example. When I sold used cars, we used to have a lot of people come in and buy, say, a 3 to 5 year old BMW 5 Series because they'd heard it's a great car and, it's a lovely thing to be in, and the badge suits what they want from, a vehicle that they're in, and the driving dynamics and everything else. But they can't afford brand new, or they're pretty scared of the residual values of buying new and then seeing how cheap they get in 5 years. And so they would come and buy a 5-year-old one. But that was great for the market because that meant there was definitely a second buyer. And if we look at 10-year-old BMWs, there's usually a buyer, which means there's a third and a fourth and a fifth buyer. And all of that has this upward pressure from the sort of cheapest of car up to brand new. People are interested in buying them. So if you can do it right, you can sort of flood the market a little bit, but if you have to have a product plan and a long-term business plan for what you're going to do in year 1, year 2, year 3 to make sure that when you get to year 3, you've got as much demand for the supply that's about to go out there. Now, we've now got to a point where we're selling cars, we've got dealerships, we've got people servicing their cars with us, and we're starting to create a bit of brand loyalty. And this is where we're going to leave our story of the car world, because ultimately at this point, we are an established car brand. We have reviews that are average to positive. We have customers. We have service centres. We have salespeople working for us. We have mechanics working for us. We have vehicle importers getting our cars into places. We have agreements with governments to sell cars. And we're now aware what's on the horizon is probably some sort of regulation change, which will change how we have to make our cars. And the funny thing is, how I started all this was about car manufacturers are always planning ahead. So from the moment we released our car, we were thinking about what is next. Now, over the last 70 years, that has been a mixed view. Partly what the car manufacturers want to do. But for the most part, they have been trying to improve their product to sell it. Okay, that means increasing the performance of the vehicle. Doing so using the least amount of fuel or energy possible, so whether it's electricity or petrol or diesel, whatever. Offering a car that is more luxurious with more features at a lower price. That is kind of the name of the game. What has increased in the last 10 years is arbitrary goals that manufacturers have to design cars to. That might be around safety equipment, which can be a very good thing. But if we roll it back a little bit, and we look at, let's just talk about safety in cars for a second, who do you think is it? Who do you think it is that actually brought the biggest change in car safety? Is it the regulators or the car manufacturers? I'm just asking you, if you're sat watching this on YouTube, or you're sat listening to this on a car ride, or you're at the gym, just in your head, just think, what thing in a car has probably made the biggest difference to the survivability and the safety of a car? Okay, I'm sure there'll be lots of different answers. Hopefully something is popping into your mind around now. So there are a few different answers because they've all had huge impacts. One of the ones that is universally sort of agreed to be either top place or joint top with one of the others would be seatbelts. Okay. Now the seatbelt is in a car because of Volvo. Volvo designed first seatbelt. They thought it was a fantastic idea. And being that this was before the time that everyone is trying to make 5 pence out of everyone else, they decided that it would be better for the world to not patent the seatbelt, okay, which means any manufacturer could just copy it and put it in their car. And there was a huge amount of resistance to this by some car companies because, of course, it increases the cost of making a car. And ultimately, it was regulation that forced in seatbelts to be fitted to cars and to be worn in cars. But the interesting point of that is it didn't start with regulation. It started with innovation, engineers working for independent companies looking for ways to improve their product. And once they came to market with it, regulators, lawmakers, and politicians realizing that this was something that could be brought in and it was better for everyone if it was universally accepted. If we zoom forward to today, that is pretty different, okay? We can look at what politicians and lawmakers did with electric cars, for example. They heard that one particular brand had done very well selling EVs, Tesla. What they didn't ask is, yes, they're selling EVs, but what realistic price point will they have to sell them at to be able to make profits long term? And then look at actually what they were selling cars for. And then ask the industry how far away it would be before they could bring their own vehicles to market. And the best way to have achieved this in the short term would have been to say an EV has zero tailpipe emissions. If that's what you want to concentrate your efforts on, then you have a very long and pointed target to the system. And you would say, by the year 2030, we want the average fleet emission coming out of the tailpipes of all of your cars to be X. And then by 2040, you want it to be Y. And 2050, you want Z. And then by 2060, 2070, whatever it would be, we want the number to be 0. What you would do in that time is allow the innovation that had brought Tesla to have EVs to be understood in the market, to then start to be brought in for the base around it. But very different to the seatbelt, this wasn't a case of adding an additional component into an existing car to improve it. This was a wholesale change of the car. And I think that is where most regulators and lawmakers didn't understand the difference as to what they had done historically and what they were doing this time. More so, when seatbelts came in, there was actually, you can find online, people resisting wearing seatbelts. What there wasn't, though, is people refusing to buy cars with seatbelts in them. Okay, maybe there was one or two people, but en masse, people were not saying, well, the car's gone up by £3.50 because you've now got a seatbelt in it and I refuse to buy it. And they weren't driving around in older cars because they hated the idea of having a car with a seatbelt. But when it came to EVs and the mandates around them, lawmakers didn't really look at a market and understand that there was be such a fundamental change. It wasn't adding one component to the car, it was changing how a car works in general. The impact that has is that if you do not provide the system around it to support the people in their decisions, then they're not going to make that decision. It's as simple as that. If you told people they had to buy diesel cars tomorrow, as regulators in Europe particularly did, in the UK especially, in 2001, and the new tax system really incentivized people to buy diesels, diesel was already at the pump. there really didn't have to be much of a change. Just when you went to the pump to top up your fuel tank, instead of using the one marked unleaded, you'd use the one marked diesel. Now, there were some other things, servicing, stuff like that, but ultimately you weren't asking people to change much. When you're enforcing them to be charging, then it becomes about where do you live? What's your access to this? How can you charge? Do you have an internal electrical system that can support sending power out to a car? All these things matter. And so today we live in a very strange world where such innovation has been made by so many people for so many car companies that it's difficult to understand where the next car would be. And in our example, our car company here, we would have already started planning whatever car we were going to make after our imaginary sort of Volkswagen E SUV and Mercedes E type sports car. The moment we released them, we would have already been planning our second cars, and it would have taken us years. We've rushed to market two vehicles that are essentially, rehashing what other people have already designed. But for our second generation, we would have probably wanted to have our own identity for a car. And like I said in the last podcast, that would probably take quite a long period of time. So we would need very, very clear direction. If it was going to have to be electric only, okay, that's fine. We would assume that whoever is putting that rule in place is going to make it so that the consumer will not have a problem doing that because their access to, for example, charging is complete. Every house in the whole country, of every single country, has access to an EV charger. EV charging is relatively cheap no matter where you go. I've never in my life, I don't think, gone to one petrol station and found it 6 times more expensive at a different petrol station, for example. But that is, or can be, the truth at some EV charge points, depending on where they are. That's not a knock on EVs, by the way. That's a knock on the suppliers who put out EVs and the governments that enforce VAT in the UK. If you go to a charge point that is not at your house, you're paying VAT for that electricity, but you're not paying it if you charge at home. So if you can charge at home, you get an even cheaper deal. And if you can't, you pay a 20% increase in price, even if you could find a charger that charged the same as someone's house. So it's an unfair system for people that cannot charge at home. And I say that as someone who has a charger at my house. I am not lost to the world that, it's an unfair system. But the answer that politicians will probably come up with will be to charge more VAT on your electricity. They never... and this is why you be very careful what you ask for, especially from politicians. Their answer is usually to take away the advantage someone has and call that equal, rather than find a way to reduce a higher cost or a higher charge that someone is facing. That's just the way they work. But the interesting thing for me is, if we were told that for our 7-8 year plan, that's the car we would make from our car company. And if in 7-8 years, a different government came in and said, you can do something different now, that is what kills car companies. That's what kills businesses, enterprises. People that have got investment for a certain way of doing things go out of business because they have bet the house on a new way of doing things or a different way of doing things that they've been told is the only way, and then find out that actually they took someone at their word who they shouldn't have trusted. And unfortunately, in the car world, regulators have rushed in with their decisions and proven themselves that because they can't fulfill their end of the bargain, they can't be trusted. And I do feel for companies like Polestar. I even feel for Tesla on it as well, because I'm sure they intended to keep ramping up production. And in fact, I think they're just going to reduce the number of models that they sell instead of building new models of cars, because they've realised that who knows what the future holds. Different politicians, different regulators will decide different things. If you're Volvo, you bet the house on not having to keep building combustion engine cars. And then in 2026, you're still building combustion engine cars, even after saying 2025 would be your cutoff. So you have to just keep going with the technology you've got. And so for us, we have to make a decision, and that will be where this podcast ends. What would you do? Would you make a decision based on what the regulators told you? Would you just go off on your own direction and say, I'm going to bet the house on building something that I don't think will be legal to sell, but I'm guessing there will be a change in the meantime, and so it will just be fine? Or do you do nothing? Those are your options. I really hope you've enjoyed this podcast and the podcast that came before it and the Miles Driven in general. If you have, then if you're watching this on a podcast player, then please do leave a like on it or whatever you can to show that you positively support it. Add a follow. All of that. Podcasts work a little bit differently to the rest of the content world, so that's sort of the only way you'll get more from us. And if you're enjoying this on YouTube, then please do add a like and a subscribe, and we shall see you all in the next one.